Thank you all for joining us. My name is Michael McFaul. I'm the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute, and this is a special webinar through the China program at APARC and FSI. I'm going to introduce our speaker, somebody I've known for a long time, and then I'll hand over the duties of moderating your questions and answers to the director of our program, the China program, Professor Genoy. I'm thrilled today to be able to introduce Stephen Lee Myers, somebody I've known for a long time since his days reporting in Moscow. He is currently the Bureau Chief in Beijing. I should rephrase that. He's the Beijing Bureau Chief currently in California on his way to South Korea, and he'll probably explain that to you in a minute. But he's been in China for several years. His last piece that I read was a spectacular piece. I think it was published May 29th on the website, called "China Created a Fail-Safe System to Track Contagions. It Failed." It's a giant, masterful piece. It covers the history of their attempts to contain the coronavirus. So I reached out to Steve wondering, what's going on with him. I knew he had been asked to leave, maybe ordered to leave is a better verb, Beijing, along with several of his colleagues at the Post and the Wall Street Journal. And that's when I discovered he was in California, where he's originally from. And we said we should get together and chat. And I thought, well, why don't we add some other people from Stanford to get to chat and take advantage of having Steve here in California, at least for a few more weeks. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve. He has reported for the New York Times for a long time. Been in Iraq. Where's my notes here? Moscow, Baghdad, and Washington, and Beijing. He is the author of a fantastic book called The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin, published in 2015. I'm pretty sure I've read every book written about Putin, and without question, this is the best book by far. So if you're interested in Putin, get that book. But if you're interested in China and what is going on today and what's going on with the New York Times today and what might be going on more broadly speaking in U.S. China relations, you're at the right place. It's my real pleasure to turn it over to Stephen right now. And for the record, this is on the record. And once Stephen has finished his introductory remarks, Genoy will take over. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. I didn't really plan a talk, so I look forward to just hearing your questions, and I'll answer them as best I can. As Michael was explaining, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, and Voice of America had all of their American reporters expelled. Notice came, I guess it was 3 weeks ago yesterday. So my life has been turned upside down a little bit in those short weeks now. And I can talk a little bit about how that came about and answer all your questions on it. In the end, it affected 14 American reporters. There's a 15th who is involved as well, working for us, Chris Buckley, who you may all know, absolutely the best journalist on China there is anywhere. He had previously been, I have to choose my word right here, he wasn't expelled. His press card was not renewed. And he was told that he has to leave the country in order to reapply. And Chris had gone to Wuhan the day they announced the lockdown. He got in just under the wire for the lockdown, and is still in Wuhan, even though his press card has expired. He has to continue. Well, he's waiting to get out, basically, and so he's not been able to report. You may have noticed his byline disappearing from the papers, sadly. But hopefully, I think in the next day or two, he'll be able to get out. And in addition to all of that, the Wall Street Journal also lost 3 reporters who were expelled only a few weeks ago in what the Chinese describe as a different case involving, if you all remember, the headline on an op-ed piece, if I remember right, the real sick man of Asia, in reference to the Chinese government. And, that phrase is a loaded one, of course, and, it was a controversial headline to start with, but 3 journal reporters were expelled specifically for that. And, so now we're talking 18 reporters have been expelled just in the last month out of China, which obviously is going to have a huge impact on coverage there. We had on the ground in the mainland 10 reporters, and so we're losing 8 of them. What we're going to try to do is keep everyone still engaged in covering China. I'm here in California awaiting my visa to go to Seoul, which is one of the places where we're going to send reporters. The others obviously are under consideration, Tokyo and Taiwan as well. The government specifically ruled out us going to Hong Kong, and which would be the obvious place to go. But they're using their leverage or their prerogative under how they define one country, 2 systems, to say that we're not welcome even in Hong Kong, which in theory, operates independently on matters like this in terms of, work permits and journalist visas and so forth. But they're invoking national security reasons so that we can't go there. I didn't really expect to leave China so abruptly. I'd only become bureau chief in December. And I can't say, though, that I'm really that surprised. And in a way, it seemed inevitable that we were going down this road. Of course, as a journalist, I think it's an unfortunate one. And, people will disagree on the cause of it. The Chinese government says that this was in response to steps that the Trump administration has taken against Chinese journalists operating in the U.S. If you remember earlier, I guess it was in February. Forgive me if some of the dates are blurring, but the administration designated the 5 major Chinese news organizations effectively as diplomatic entities, being owned by the state or controlled by the state. They were essentially put under the reporting requirements like the people at the embassies or consulates in the U.S. And that then was followed shortly by the journal expulsions, the U.S. then invoking this new power, capped the number of journalists at those 5 Chinese news organizations, including Xinhua, which is the biggest. And then that led to us being targeted. And, I don't know if we're done with the tit for tat at this point. It could continue for a while. But it does seem to me to reflect the downward spiral of the relationship more broadly. And I think, I mean, you're all watching this very closely, so I don't have to tell you, but from my own perspective, when I went to Beijing, which was only in 2017, so not even 3 years, it was a different time. It was a different relationship. It was the beginning of the Trump administration, and of course, he had been very aggressive on the campaign trail, which had been noted, but the relationship in a way seemed to start okay. Certainly there seemed to be a personal rapport between the 2 leaders and everything. And then of course it descended into the trade war. And since then you've seen, I think, a downward spiral, and I'm not sure how much worse it can get. But it comes now, or this has all come in the middle of this, pandemic, which began in China, unless you believe some of the other theories, which we can talk about, and seems to be bringing out, if I may say frankly, the worst instincts in around the world, by the way, not just in the, but certainly the hostility, the animosities that have always been there, I think, are really coming out in the way both countries are responding to this crisis. The way the public reaction and sentiment to it is really striking, and again in both directions. We've seen a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment boiling over, not just in the U.S. but around the world. And now in China, you're seeing a lot of anti-foreign sentiment. I just heard about anti-Nigerian sentiment in Guangzhou. And part of that is because the government, I think, is playing up the idea that it's a dangerous world out there, and I think they're afraid, and maybe with some reason, that of cases coming back into China. So they've restricted flights, and which of course made my getting out of there even more difficult. And that's up around. There's signs saying foreigners stay out of restaurants and things like that. So it's I don't want to call it a race to the bottom, but it definitely does seem like there's the relationship, that the worst instincts, or the I'm not saying this right, I don't think, but the hostilities that were long repressed and maybe marginalized have come to the forefront, I think. And the question that's going to be interesting to see is how you get out of that. A lot of people on both sides of the relationship will tell you it's not inevitable that we descend into conflict. But what I've seen in the last few days makes me think, while it might not be inevitable, it certainly would be pretty easy to get to that point. And if you just think about all of the other potential flashpoints in that, in the relation, you could see it getting to that, I think, rather quick. Anyway, I can talk a lot about a lot of things, so I'll be interested in what you're most interested in as well, and answer what I can. We can talk a little bit about the origins of this. We can talk about the story that Michael mentioned on why this surfaced, despite the precautions, the safeguard they had built into the system after SARS. And we can talk a little bit about the hostility, the conspiracy theories. Single most read story that I've written on this thing, that I know of anyway, was the one where the spokesman for the foreign ministry suggested this was the U.S. Army's doing somehow. And that notion, as well as other notions or other conspiracies that are out there, seem to be gaining a lot of traction. And I don't know how you can beat some of those back. And then, of course, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on what this means for Xi and for the Communist Party. It feels to me like a reckoning is coming. The guy at the passport control when I arrived in LAX last week seemed like a really smart guy and saw where I was coming from. And, he said, China has a lot to answer for, don't they? And I think that's true. And I think that's true for the Chinese people. And I think it's going to be true for the world as well, once we get past this crisis. So I'll stop there and just answer all your questions as best I can.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Steve. I think we could keep you here for at least a week, because you touched on so many interesting things. But let me just take the opportunity, since I'm handling the Q&A, to ask a question. And that is, you were expelled about a week ago, right? About a week and a half ago. But before you were expelled, and the others that were expelled, can you tell us what type of access you had while you were still there before you were expelled? And I ask this in part in relation to the last point that you made about the feelings of Chinese citizens. Because we know that, for example, at the height of this, particularly when Dr. Lee, the person who first tried to alert everyone that there was this very contagious disease, and then he died. There was a huge outpouring that seemed to go beyond the control of the censors to really tamp down the comments that were being made. And I'm just curious if Chinese were willing to talk to a reporter from New York Times, other Western sources.
So I'll answer that in two ways, and I'll back up a little bit. Since I got there, again, not that long ago, it's less than 3 years, there's been a noticeable reluctance among people to foreign media, and you can sense the change. And I remember one of the first stories I did when I was there was about the trade in ivory, and they were banning all commercial sale of ivory. And which was a huge step. I was able to talk to somebody with the Ministry of Forestry and Natural Resources that oversees forestry and grasslands, that oversees the trade. That kind of access, it seems impossible in the last year or so. Ministries routinely decline to speak to us. Other than the foreign ministry briefing, which are helpful to a degree, it's very difficult to get anyone on an official level to answer a question, even on kind of non-controversial topics or topics that like on ivory trade or on other issues of the day, anything political. Certainly the economy and the officials who oversee that are a little bit more forthcoming, though that's not my area of responsibility. But you've definitely, in the last few years, and particularly since the change in constitution affecting Xi's term limits, you've noticed a tightening up of official sources. On the ground, generally, people would be a little bit more open, I found, and not outwardly hostile for the most part. So you could meet people in places and talk to them, but also, again, on very sensitive subjects, people were afraid to speak to foreign media generally. And that has really picked up. And I can tell you a funny story about a photographer I know who was out shooting just recently after the headline in the Wall Street Journal came out. And the Wall Street Journal, like the New York Times, is banned. You can't read that inside the firewall. But this photographer was taking pictures of people in the early days of the lockdown around the country, and photographed a woman in a park doing her exercise with a mask on, and then mentioned the woman asked where they were from, and she explained, the photographer, that they were with the Wall Street Journal, at which point she completely lost her temper and told them to get lost, because she had heard of this headline. And again, as I was mentioning, the anti-foreign sentiment related to the virus has been picking up as well. So it really does seem to have been a shift in recent, even a worsening, even from a low level, just in the last couple of months.
So, because there is a question that's come in that wanted to hear your evaluation of the foreign press's reporting of COVID-19. So do you think that biased the reporting? I mean, what was happening to reporters?
I have a thick skin and an open mind, and a lot of people don't like our coverage of China, I'll say frankly. But I'll also say I think it's the best there is, and I'm speaking of my colleagues at the other newspapers as well. I mean, certainly the Chinese government doesn't like when we write things that would be critical. A lot of Chinese people don't. They don't want bad things about their country. When it comes to how they've built things or raising tough questions, it's just not tradition in China today for that kind of skeptical reporting. And but I would say that what was really striking early days of this crisis was how much good Chinese reporting was being done. Caixin, particularly South China Morning Post, Sixth Tone, which is part of the government, apparatus. Nonetheless, we're doing really, really sharp journalism. We were relying a lot on the scoops that they were coming up with, the contacts they were finding. In some cases, we worked with journalists from Chinese news organizations. And then, if those became too sensitive, of course, they were censored. And lots of stories would appear and then disappear quickly from online if they struck a nerve or they were deemed too negative or something. But generally, I think our coverage has been pretty thorough. And again, there were 10 of us on the ground working on it, as well as reporters and editors in Hong Kong. And in the early days of this, before it became the global crisis that it is now, the number of people turning to the Times to read it in particular was staggering. We'd never had kind of readership before. And it was staggering also inside China. So, I think people crave, a kind of objective, fair and balanced. People may not always agree with me, but I definitely think, the coverage has been pretty good and thorough and pretty fair.
Right. Okay. There's also a question that's somewhat related to this, and that is, the CIA saying that China's seriously underreporting the fatality. Comment on that?
Well, I don't have access to CIA reports. If I did, I would appreciate it. So if anyone has them, send them my way. But it seems pretty clear to me just on the evidence that they took some pretty extreme measures to tamp down the spread of the virus, and they've been credited with having succeeded in those measures. It also seems pretty clear to me that the curve stopped a little too abruptly. I haven't been reporting many deaths or new cases at all in recent weeks, and it just seems like, given what we know about the spread of this, that while they would level the curve, as the saying goes, you still have more cases after that, and it seems a little suspicious that they've just stopped. And how many? I mean, there's some reporting and some anecdotal evidence in terms of the number of funeral urns that have been ordered in Wuhan and stuff that suggest that, in fact, the numbers could be many thousands higher. But they also will say, well, people in a city of 11 million people die all the time, and so are those people dying from COVID-19, or are they dying from other illnesses that maybe were hastened by COVID-19, and so forth? As I said earlier, I think there's going to have to be a reckoning at some point, and I assume the number will ultimately come out, and we'll see that it was pretty significantly underreported right now.
So there's been this blame game that's been going on everywhere, but particularly in China. And so the central officials could always say, well, we didn't actually know, and they blamed it on the Wuhan officials. So that was like early on in the crisis. And so right now, you have China being in this position where they've gotten a lot of positive press because they actually instituted very draconian measures to lock down everyone and stop the spread. And so at the same time, that then creates new incentives for local officials perhaps to not report the deaths. What do you think about sort of that type of theory?
So the story that we looked into was how they had created a system through the Centers for Disease Control, in which they doctors and hospitals were able to report these kinds of infections and contagions automatically. And the reason they set that up is because when SARS happened, the local government, in that case in Guangzhou, didn't report that there were these mysterious illnesses, which turned out to be SARS. And so they created this system because they are encouraging people to don't be afraid. If this is a matter of public health, report it. And that's how the system's supposed to work. And it has worked in other cases. Even recently, last fall, there was cases of pneumonic plague that had appeared in Inner Mongolia, and those were reported instantly, and everybody knew about them. And that's how, that kind of information is how it's supposed to work, because once you know, then you can respond. In this case, it seemed as though the officials were still reluctant to input the information into the system, and that resulted in a delay. And there were even specific provisions made if you couldn't tell what the was, which of course, this being a new coronavirus, they didn't know what it was. They thought it looked like SARS, but it's different. And so that there was even a way for that kind of unknown virus to be reported in the system. But the officials in the health department, the health commission in Wuhan City and in the province of Hubei decided not to report. They essentially circumvented the system. And it was when people came forward, the doctors in particular, who, by the way, in the case of Dr. Li, they weren't warning the public. They weren't whistleblowing per se. They were actually informing each other. And in his case, it was his medical school colleagues telling them, hey, everybody, watch out. There's this thing going around. Be careful. It wasn't meant to be public, but just informing people, on the front line. And they were reprimanded for that. There's still, I think, a wariness among officials of bringing bad news to the top, because it reflects badly on your governance, your local actions.
Do you think that she has actually, how do you think he's weathered this? Do you think that he's been successful in blaming the lower levels and presenting himself as somebody that's the emperor coming to save the country?
There was early on, there seemed to be a conspicuous lack of Xi, if I can put it like that. We're so used to him leading the news every night and being on the front page of the paper. And there was a period of several days fairly early on in this crisis, from the end of January into February, where we just didn't see him. He had issued orders on the I believe it was January 20th. Very brief written statement came out, but under his his name. And then he chaired a meeting on the 25th of the standing committee, which is in itself was significant because there was video of it, which apparently is quite rare. And then nothing for weeks, or very little. And he deputized the prime minister to lead the effort. And finally again surfaced and started first in Beijing. He did a tour around town, and then he's just recently finally made it to Wuhan itself. That led to a lot of speculation about what was behind that. Was he uncertain? Did he not know what to do? Was he trying to sort of deflect blame from him and be the sort of savior above the mere politics, but sort of act as a father of the nation type figure? And some people even speculated that there may be signs of turmoil because of this, questions about his leadership and so forth. But in the end, I think they've come up with strategy of portraying him in this way of being not in the fray, but guiding the response, from a distance perhaps, without getting his hands too dirty in it. But we've seen the narrative change a little bit from the beginning. I think they were really I don't want to say panicked, but like everybody, they were dealing with an incredibly difficult health crisis, and there weren't beginning really clear answers of what to do. They know better, and now they're saying they changed their message to they can lead the global response to this, and that they've a good example for everybody else to follow. And in some ways, there's truth to that, and so others will point to the early failures or the lack of transparency about the numbers, which we already mentioned. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say it's the end of the Communist Party. This is the Chernobyl moment for Xi and the party. But I think it's probably premature to see that. I mean, I think if history proves anything, the party can be quite resilient and will probably survive this, I think. But it certainly raised a lot of questions about how the place is governed.
A related question, this one's actually from Mike McFaul, and that's so the question is, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman, Zhao Lijian, do you think that his views represent the views of government, and particularly, what you were just saying about Xi? Do you think that he is actually okaying some of these comments that are coming out, particularly from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs? This guy was like a real flamethrower.
For those who don't know, he was the one who put out a tweet suggesting the U.S. Army might have been behind this outbreak when they visited the World Military Games, which were in Wuhan in October of last. I've heard, and I can't pretend that I can say this definitively, but I've heard that there are a lot of people who look at that style and think it's idiotic. Other people in the ministry, it's the concept of Twitter. When it comes to diplomacy, we're used to it, I guess now, in our country. But for Chinese diplomats, it's really an unnatural format. It doesn't fit their style of diplomacy, generally speaking. And the fact that he has used it to great effect is a sign, I think, of them being a little bit savvier about using the social media platforms that are available. Again, outside the firewall, Twitter, of course, is banned in China. But you've seen, I think, at last count, there were more than 100 ambassadors and diplomats who've showed up on Twitter. The State Council has a Twitter account now, and I think they see that it's a good forum to get their message out. And whether or not he represents the views of the foreign ministry, I think the answer to that is yes. He was tortured a little bit about it when he showed up again this week at the briefing, the foreign ministry briefing, because they rotate the spokespeople. So he showed up and he said he was speaking personally in this case. But the fact that he was promoted from, he was the deputy chief of mission in Pakistan to such a prominent position, I think shows that kind of feistiness, if you want to call it that, is being rewarded. And, some people say a more combative response, to, again, what I was mentioning before about the attitudes in the United States, being a little bit more combative seems to be what they're looking for right now.
So also along the same lines, there's questions about, do you think that China is sort of essentially winning the propaganda war in the sense that, one, they have gotten a lot of good press in the U.S. because we're not doing enough in a lot of places. And they're also going around the world sending very much needed supplies. So where do you think it stands with regards to, in the sense of China's image at this point? And are they really trying to turn the discussion, just turn their whole image around?
I mean, my feeling about propaganda generally is that it tends to win over the people who are inclined one way or the other. So I've seen and hear from a lot of people who are what you would call pro-China, who think that yeah, they're doing okay. It is smart actually to provide aid because that's what responsible countries do, and many other countries are doing that as well, including the United States. And so if you're going to be a global superpower, you should be helping other countries in need. And so in that sense, I mean, I can even take it at face value that their motives may be sincere, not simply propaganda. But then you'll have the people who are China haters, who will say this is all cynical. They're actually selling most of this stuff. They're not donating it, though Jack Ma has been donating a lot of stuff. That you saw some blowback with some of the supplies that were sent to Spain and the Netherlands of not being really good quality, and that fed again into the people who would say you can't trust China, you can't trust Chinese equipment or manufacturing. And so I think it pays both ways, the propaganda, I think. And I think a lot of people, as I mentioned, the guy stamped my passport coming back to America, are thinking, this came from China. It was made worse by mistake that were made early on in the Chinese response, and people will remember that if they're kind and forget that a lot of the masks they're wearing now come from China.
Right here, just a very quick point. One of the questions asked, you said that China has a lot to answer for. What do you think are the main issues you're referring to?
I mean, I can give you a whole list of what I think China should answer for. We could start with Xinjiang, for example, or Tibet. But in the case of the crisis, I think people be asking hard questions about how this happened, and why did you have a system in place, and why didn't it work? Why did you doctors who were simply warning other doctors? Why are you suppressing information even now about the origins of the virus? And then that feeds into the worst, as I mentioned, the worst instincts of people, say in Washington, who are looking at this and saying this is a cover up. And I've seen some reporting, not just on the numbers, but even the origin. There was a piece that went out on ABC about that this might have started earlier, might have come from a lab, and not been an accidental release through the market. Those kinds of things. I think that China needs to come up with better explanations about what happened, to I think suppress that line of thinking. Those conspiracy theories take root when there's uncertainty, and it would help if they could come forward and be more honest about what they do know about what happened, when were the first cases, instead of being defensive about it.
Right. Do you think that there's a question from HR McMaster? It says, do you think that more businesses will naturally decouple from China due to the pressure that they are under from the CCP, unfair CCP trade and economic practices, and the fragility of supply chains highlighted by COVID-19?
Yes, I think is the short answer to that. It's a great question. But I was at a briefing with the European Bureau of Commerce there, who were taught some of the problems. Again, this was before it became a pandemic. The problems that they were having with certain factories, and how the lockdown at the time was affecting. If all of your eggs were in one basket, the head of the chain was saying, and that basket is in lockdown, you're in trouble. And so he said that there were already companies beginning to think of how do you diversify, and that seems to have been always a policy of this administration as well, to encourage businesses to decouple a little bit. can you in this globalized age succeed in doing that entirely? I think that's a more. I'm not really able to answer that question. I would call a bunch of experts and try to figure out what everyone thinks. I think it could be cool, just given the nature of the economy today. But I know people are thinking about it.
Right. There are a number of questions asking about, going the idea that how long China One can keep the Western press out, and how much leverage that they can get from this. And what do you think is the future? I mean, do you think that you're going to get back in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and such, that they're going to get back into China anytime soon? And what would it take to achieve that?
That's a great question. I don't expect that I'll be able to work there again. Sadly, I don't imagine that at any point they're going to just say, no, sorry, never mind, come on back, I think that they were quite upset about what the U.S. did to the Chinese journalists, and they felt they had to respond to that. And so would a new administration in the U.S. Or a new administration in China, would they, push the pause button and try to start again? And that the press could be one, I mind, fairly easy give for both sides. I mean, I'm sure why they were so upset about the Chinese journalist in the U.S. And felt they needed to restrict them the way that they have. Obviously, foreign journalists, not just Americans, but all foreign journalists in China have worked in a much more restrictive environment, which is brought up in the reports that the Foreign Correspondents Association does. It's brought up in the press freedom reports and by Freedom House and the U.S. government and so forth. But I don't see any circumstance in the next couple of years where you're going to have China withdraw this. And what I find worrisome about it, and forgive my self-interest as a journalist, but I like journalists. I think journalists are good people, and they're good for a country, and it's good for China to see the New York Times thinks of it. And, our reporting being different, being like just coming from a different point of view, which I understand, not a political point of view, but just, the culture of journalism is different in America than it is in China. But I think it's healthy. And what's funny, and I sat through these meetings with the foreign ministry in this couple of weeks, including a response to the letter sent by our three publishers, the public letter they sent. If you have a chance to read that, they called me in to read me their response to it, and they welcome reporting, they welcome people, foreigners being in China and telling China's story. And what's funny, and I pointed this out to them, is that they hate the New York Times, and they repeatedly in the Chinese media will tell you how awful we are and how biased we are, except when we do a story they suddenly say, oh, the New York Times said blah blah blah. It's a bit like our president now, who often rants about the New York Times, but he reads it every day, and when he likes something, he'll say what a great story that was. And last year I wrote a story about science fiction blockbuster that came out, this film called The Wandering Earth, and I wrote a straight news story about this was their big science fiction blockbuster, their first one. Like, why hadn't they made a big blockbuster sci-fi film before? And, the story was quoted all over Chinese media because it said China had made its first big science fiction blockbuster, So I think it's good for any country to read the coverage. It's good to read coverage of America written by foreign journalists, if you ask me. So, I hope that someday they'll reverse this, but I don't see it happening soon, sadly.
Also, we have a question from Philip Topman, who asked to compare working as a New York Times correspondent in Russia and China. So that would be a very interesting question. Is it? Yes.
I didn't work in Russia during the Soviet era, so take that with into consideration when I say this. Russia is an infinitely more open and friendly and fun place to report than China. You just simply, the society itself is just much more open. And I was recently in Irkutsk, actually, I was visiting Lake Baikal. And, in Irkutsk, you could see the opposition leader's headquarters walking, he has a headquarters in Irkutsk, a regional capital. And you can't imagine walking in any city in China and coming across an opposition, headquarters, or even an opposition person, wouldn't advertise them. So, that it was just one episode of just how different it is there. Which is not to say that Russia is a free and open place, but compared to China, it was much, much easier to report and talk to people. Somebody asked this the other day. I was able to report out a book on Putin. And I talked to people who knew Putin when he was a kid. I talked to sources in the government that had worked with him over his long years in power. And in China, it's almost inconceivable that you would have access like that to anyone near Xi. And what biographies there have been written about Xi are pretty limited to just his public, known public statements or actions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I also have a question here from Tom Finger, and he wants to know, how would the relationship descend into conflict? What would prompt either U.S. or PRC to attack the other?
It's an excellent question. You may not need one intentional prompt. I could see a situation like we've had in the past with the plane that was shot down in 2001 in the Bush administration, and had to crash land in Hainan. There was a near accident in the South China Sea just last, I guess, more than a year ago. You could end up with some inadvertent issue along the border or in the South China Sea where an accident turns deadly. That I think that would be a likely case. But then the other ones you can spin out pretty easily. There would be a move against Taiwan, a move against the Japanese disputed islands. One hopes cooler heads prevail, but at a time when tensions are already so high, you could see that mistakes could be made. They could lead into a broader conflict.
So this question is a very interesting one about how the Chinese people sort of view the way the U.S. has handled the crisis, and how do you think the COVID-19 crisis will affect the way that Chinese people perceive the U.S. and the West? Because already, after the global financial crisis, there were some that were saying, well, this really shows, the decline of the U.S. It's only going to, you think, strengthen that view? And
so, if you look at this again, I was in Beijing when all this started, and if you remember in the early days, the move to close travel for Chinese, that really didn't go well. Was it the right thing to do? I'll let others decide that, but certain perception was very negative. And the move against Huawei, the moves against some of the scientists and research that have been going on, I think a lot of this is fueling, however justified it might be from the American point of view, it fueling a lot of resentment that the U.S. is targeting the Chinese people, not for political reasons even, or maybe partly political, but even for racist reasons. And I think the reaction to the headline in the Wall Street Journal reflected that. And and the government and the party, they gave that up. That's why the photographer I was telling you about, had this angry reaction from a woman in the park who I guarantee was not a Wall Street Journal subscriber. I think that there is a view that there's something wrong in America, and there's something hostile about America. And that said, again, a lot of the people that I know, the people that you all know who travel and work, study in the U.S., one hopes that, they learn from that example, the positive sides of American life and culture. But the negative, they see the negative as well. I think, again, in moments of crisis like this, the negative seems to be taking precedence. And you see that reflected in the people's attitudes towards the U.S. and in general. I mean, we'll see longer term once this crisis is over, if the students come back in the same numbers, if the tourists come back, and I would say that works for China as well.
But the fact that the U.S. is having such difficulty coordinating response, do you think that the party is going to be effectively able to use this to tout the superiority of their own regime?
Yeah, and you've already seen that actually with the response, not just in the US, but in Italy, and Spain and elsewhere. And there's certainly a narrative. It isn't quite stated so baldly, but that China handled and the U.S. hasn't. And we're giving aid to the U.S., and we're donating masks and things like that. And that plays well among people that, that whatever flaws there might have been early on. You mentioned Dr. Lee's death. When he died, there was it felt like an earthquake, the public reaction to that. And of course it was quickly suppressed, but that with the benefit of a couple months of hindsight, however many hundreds of thousands of cases there are now in the US, maybe that doesn't seem like such a bad memory, or at least it's a distant memory now. And I think that has played very well into the party's propaganda effort.
I mean, I know this is hard to know, but I'm curious to know, how effective do you think the censorship system has been during this crisis in China, and then as it's calmed down? Did you get a sense before you left that social media and such are being more effectively censored or less? Because there was these reports that they were just not able to really control the people's anger, sort of in the height of during this crisis.
Well, actually, I would argue that they were able to control people's anger, because it didn't get anywhere, right? And if there had not been the restrictions that that they put in place, and often very quickly, again, I'm not an expert in the technology of this, but things disappear within minutes, and there are people who track this, and when they see something, they try to save it before it disappears. So anything that might seem critical, and articles, again, mainstream news organizations are taken down immediately if they have offending material in them. So I think they're pretty effective at it, and they have a long track record and a lot of practice in censoring information that's, uncomfortable for the government.
And then we have a question that talks about the economic in particular, but the question is, do you think that the Belt and Road Initiative is significantly hampered by the COVID-19? And then the question about how successful has it been prior to this?
There are a lot of people have theories on the Belt and Road stuff. I mean, obviously, all economic, investment and activity is grinding to a halt worldwide right now. So, it's going to be difficult, I think, for everybody to bounce back from that. Has it been successful? It's sort of become this monster, the Belt and Road thing, that it's everything now. So they can talk. They're even talking about having a public health Belt and Road now out of this crisis. But what does that mean? It's a branding issue, I think, as much as anything else. But has the investments that have been made in infrastructure and airports and roads and stuff been effective for some of the countries involved? I think, yeah. Has it deeply indebted other countries? Yes, I think that's true too. And so I think that over time we'll see how successful it will be, but in over decades, I mean, before we know if it was a really successful program and extending China's influence, if that was part of the intention, but also helping improve China's own economy. I mean, a lot of this seemed to be designed to keep its companies busy and its steel makers, and so forth, in business. So.
Right. Okay, we only have a couple minutes, but I want to just turn back to Mike to see if Mike has any sort of final questions. I know he was at a bit of a disadvantage in trying to ask questions. So, Mike, do you have any further questions? And then I want to turn it back to Steve and let Steve say the final few words. Mike?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Can or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can.
Okay. I was kicked out of the panelist session for a while, so I could ask a question. No, I don't. All I want to do is thank Stephen. This has been fantastic. You're welcome back, no matter where you are. I just think I just want to underscore one thing you said earlier that really resonated with me. That I hope one day the Chinese understand why it's important to have people like you reporting on them, because you learn from that. As you said, we learn from reporting about us. And John Pumphrey had a piece in the Post on this. I don't know if you saw it, talking about there's a long history, hundreds of years of history of this in China. And I hope someday people will come to recognize that. But we most certainly do. I think the coverage that you all have been doing already under extraordinary circumstances, including, the last time we saw each other over the summer, exacerbated now. I just want to continue. I just want to wish you well in continuing to do what I think is just vital reporting, not just for America, but the world. But final comments back to you, Stephen.
Well, thank you for that. And as I said, we're going to try to do as best we can to set up in the near abroad and keep covering China as best we can. I was actually thinking about this in a sort of broad historical sense. There was the time when China was closed to the world, and I believe we had a reporter in Hong Kong who would decipher rumors and people who did travel back and forth, and you would piece together your reports like that. And it was in a way a time when it was easier for the government in China to shut itself off from the world, and it still didn't stop us from trying to peek inside. And some people were able to get in, and even height of the Cultural Revolution and so forth. Some journalists as well. And so hopefully we're not going to be back to that. We'll still have a couple reporters left in the mainland, and they'll be obviously really stressed, and a lot of work will fall on them, including helping us, those of us outside. But we'll keep at it, and I hope the other papers do as well, and that the Chinese journalists who are doing great work are able to continue that. We'll keep reading them as well. And I would just say thank you to everyone for your questions. It's always a thrill to talk, and you can reach me easily through email, so feel free to reach out anytime if you have issues you think we should be doing more on.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say thank the audience, because there were a lot more questions than we were able to get to. They were great questions. And again, thank you for all your work, Steve, and hope that you can continue this, because what you were describing was the way that scholars used to have to study China from across the border. So hopefully that we can at least keep U.S. China relations to a point where that all of this doesn't also end. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.